Can folks think of reasons why we would do it this way? Yeah. Well, that's true, but I don't know if that was your point. Your point was saying really take advantage of group 1, group 2, group 3.
Well, so I mean, you ran with the school.
Yeah.
You could, like, older kids who receive in school 3 didn't receive any treatment, not 0.
Yeah. Depending on what they had actually complied with themselves, you're saying. Yeah. Uh-huh. So you're saying use the actual take-up decision of individuals and take advantage of all that variation, because some folks in group 1 took it for 3 years, others took it for 1 year, just based on their own compliance. Okay, so I mean,
no,
assignment, based on assignment.
Yeah,
huh?
based on assignment. You track whether or not they were treated school or whether they actually took the drug.
Yeah.
So looking at time they took the drug.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can anybody think of why we wouldn't track times they took the drug, or the reasons not to do that? Part of it is, maybe this is what the comment before was about, but there's this issue of individual selection. Some people take the drugs more or less. We don't necessarily want that variation. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so so part of it was that even if you didn't take the drugs, we showed there were these externality benefits. You were kind of treated, but not entirely treated. Part of it is there were these older girls that were supposed to not get treated. Some of them were. So when we initially constructed this variable assigned to treatment, we were sort of setting that number to 0 for the girls 13 and older. And there were basically a lot of decisions we could have taken. We kind of felt like this was the simplest and the cleanest way to go. I will say that if you break out group 1, group 2, group 3, group 1 gains a bit more than group 2 gains more than group 3, so things line up. I think for us, we had a little bit of a taste for simplicity, and for lots of like the plots that I'll show you and the analysis, having the treatment and control kind of simple design clarifies things, we thought, in terms of the presentation and the regressions. But then we've generated another set of tables that use the kind of years of assigned treatment as well. It was more a question of taste. You get the same answers, basically. Yeah.
If I remember right, in school with this,
yeah.
female actually gained less than males?
Well, the older females gain less. A lot of them were not supposed to get treated. If you look at the younger females, they gain a lot. They're getting treated, they gain a lot as well. And in fact, in year 2 of the program, if you look at that table, the females gain a little more than the males in year 2. But they're very similar gains. They're very similar gains.
So it's mostly just the age effect, the tiny effect, like a low effect group that's reading more for the gender control.
Well, the issue with the older girls is they were supposed to not get treated. So it's beyond even just the age effect. It's that most of them didn't get treated. So even though they're experiencing externality, they're not getting that additional direct treatment benefit. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a question here, was the gain among females larger because they were younger? And I have to think about that table and how we handle the age issue there. Because we broke things down by male and female. I'm trying to imagine the table in my head. If someone has the paper in front of them, it's table, I don't know, 7 or 8, panel B. 2/3 down the page 3007. No, I'm not looking at that. But I have to think about whether we excluded the older females or not. But that's an interesting point. And maybe part of it is the age effect. This is getting ridiculous. Okay, this is like, I'm going to have this. You guys have to. I'm really embarrassed, more than anything. You guys are so smart. I don't know. I just look at everything very warily now. The world has just turned on me. Stand back. Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. So, let me give you a little more sense. There's this big education difference. In terms of labor market gains, we see pretty similar earnings gains. So, let me give you the bottom line numbers. I'm going to come back to your point because it's really central to the story in the new paper. So overall, there are these gains in hours worked by 16%. So the average hours worked per week for this sample 10 years later is about 20 hours per week, and it goes up by about 3 hours a week. That's a huge effect. There's a huge effect from being healthier in childhood. Average earnings among the people earning wages. So this is excluding people in subsistence agriculture for whom it's very hard to measure productivity. They're basically like producing and consuming their own food. But for people that are out and have jobs and earning money, their earnings are over 20% larger in the treatment group. These are really huge effects. That earnings gain is actually similar for males and females. The hours work gain is actually larger among males. So there's an interesting story where males' participation, their labor supply, their participation in the workforce is increasing significantly. For females, not so much. In terms of time spent in schooling, females' time spent in schooling, like we're in secondary school, is going up, but not males. There's actually a recent paper, just came out a few months ago, by the authors are Pitt et al., 2012, in the American Economic Review. And they have a theoretical model and then some data from Bangladesh where they're interested in similar issues. They don't have the kind of data exactly that we have or the kind of experiment that we have exactly. But they have a model where they say, look, in societies where there are big, large share of the population is going into manual labor tasks, if for whatever reason that improvement in health has more of a labor market payoff for men than women, so it may have a payoff for women, but if it's comparatively larger for men, then when men get healthier, they may spend more of their time working, and women, because their comparative advantages in other types of skills, will actually spend more of their kind of healthy time because they're better health investing in human capital and getting schooling. So it's kind of neat. We came up with our results before knowing about the model, but if there's some kind of comparative advantage for males in what they call a brawn-based economy, a relative advantage to healthier males in that sector, you could see this kind of specialization where people would take their better health and sort of apply it in different directions. So women are still earning more, but they're doing it by getting more schooling and shifting into different types of work, and the men aren't getting as much schooling, but they're shifting into better paid work in other dimensions. So actually the occupations line up interestingly. A lot more of the men go into manufacturing jobs, which tend to be very manual labor jobs. There aren't that many women doing manufacturing jobs in our sample. Now some of that could be due to social norms, legal restrictions. There's all kinds of restrictions, legal and cultural restrictions in rural Western Kenya on maybe women's access to certain jobs. So we have to separate out comparative advantage from other constraints. But the proportion of men doing manufacturing triples in the treatment group. That's a huge change. For women, we see other shifts. We see a significant shift in women becoming small business owners and entrepreneurs, and many fewer women doing domestic servant work, which is very difficult and crappy work. To be a domestic servant. So you see these occupational shifts, and those occupational shifts can account for a lot of those earning gains. So the fact that men are doing less casual labor, like spot labor, and doing more factory labor, those are very well paid jobs in Kenya, manufacturing jobs. They earn twice as much as the average wage earning job. And the fact that women are going to basically small business and out of domestic work can also explain some of the earnings. So there's a lot of interesting shifts going on, but the response in the long run looks very gendered. That men and women are using their health differently and still benefiting from it, but in very different ways. Yeah?
I'm wondering if mental health indicators are tracked at all. I mean, there's a case for depression being on the strap, being brought on by
it's a great idea, and we were very into that idea when we designed the survey. So we have a range of questions. We have there are these modules that have been developed, and some have been validated in African settings to gauge depression. These batteries of 10 or 12 questions where you ask people about various types of anxiety and sadness. And so we did that. We asked some of the kind of classic happiness questions that are in the economics literature, kind of well-being questions, and we don't find any impacts on those. So that was interesting to us. You find some positive point estimates, but nothing really strong or significant. So there are these labor market gains and some education gains, but it doesn't necessarily reflect itself in less depression in our sample. But we thought very seriously about that mechanism, so we collected all these questions. I mean, it's very plausible. So yeah, Becca. Yeah, there is. There's a paper, and I think I probably forgot to cite it before, but it's Kerwin et al., and I think it's 2010. It's in a public health journal. Remind me if I've already mentioned this, but this was a randomized controlled trial in Nigeria of preschool kids, half of whom received deworming. Then they tracked them a year and a half later and looked at their infection levels with the malaria parasite to get exactly your point. Like, if I'm getting this one set of parasites out of my body, so I'm getting dewormed, am I better able to fight off other types of infection? And they find a significant reduction in Plasmodium infection, the malaria parasite infection, in the treatment group. So that's some evidence that there might be an immunological response. Now, the counterpoint could be, well, these kids were dewormed, their behavior changed, maybe their behavioral change changed their exposure to Plasmodium. I don't think they can kind of rule that out, but it's at least suggestive that there's some kind of immunological response. Yeah. Did you have a hand up?
Okay. As far as depression, is it possible it's just a social stigma of depression if we're not actually answering questions accurately? Because you ask someone else to find rather than just guide the answer.
Well, we get a fair share of people with expressing very severe sadness and other things. So in these surveys, we do get a lot of people expressing that they're not happy, etc. There's a lot of variation in it, but the treatment doesn't predict it. So, yep. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So a fair share of these folks had schisto at baseline. Almost all of them had a geohelminth, and then I forget the number, if it's 30% or something also had schisto, and in the areas where there was schisto prevalence above at least 30% in school, there was mass treatment with praziquantel. So this is a combined treatment for soil transmitted helminths and schisto. That's the way to think about it. The question comes out like how much of this is due to the schisto versus the geohelminths, and we have run some analysis separately in those different areas. Where in some areas it's schisto plus geohelminths, in others it's just geohelminths. But when we split the sample that way, we don't have that much power to reject the hypothesis that they're equal effects. So we rarely reject that hypothesis. So it's probably because we're underpowered. So we basically can't know exactly how much is schisto or geohelminths probably. That's the limitation. It's a combination of the two. Okay, so we find these gains. I talked about the shifts in saccharin. Now that some of you know about kernel densities, we can kind of go through this. And for those that don't, I'll describe what it is. What we have plotted out here is the distribution of data on earnings in logs to get proportional changes. This is the standard way to do it in labor economics. For the treatment group in blue, with the blue dashes, and the control group in red. And a kernel density is nice because it portrays the data in a really non-parametric way. What non-parametric means is you don't make any assumptions about what the data is going to look like. The plot is just based on how many observations you have at each of these earnings levels, and it kind of portrays it as faithfully as possible. So you see a few things. First, log earnings look roughly normal, and that's the kind of well-known finding. They're not exactly log normal earnings, but they're roughly log normal. So the logs give us something here. How would people characterize where in the distribution you're seeing effects in terms of treatment versus control group? Yeah. So maybe at the very top they're kind of on top of each other, but as we get a little closer into the real bulk of the distribution, then we see this kind of shift. Right. So the very top they're kind of on top of each other. Also at the very bottom, any other patterns that come through, or other than the very tails, though, it kind of looks like there's a shift in many parts of the distribution, right? So maybe excluding the top 5 and bottom 5%, you do see this sort of shift. So it's pretty consistent with the data. I didn't, just for the sake of time, didn't put the same distribution up for hours worked for males, but you see the same kind of shift for males in terms of hours worked. One of the things that's noticeable about hours worked is there are relatively few males in a control group working like very long hours, like 50 to 60 to 65 hours per week, and that's where you see a bunch of mass in the treatment group going. And part of that is due to the manufacturing jobs. So manufacturing jobs have very long work weeks. In our data, their average work week is about 10 hours longer than the average of all wage jobs. So their average is 50-something hours per week, and we know the treatment group was able to shift into those jobs, and that's what's explaining a lot of these earnings gains and the hours work gains as well. So that's part of the story. Yep. Yeah, so these the people with no labor earnings are already excluded here because the log of 0 is not defined. So these are all people who are earning something. This is the distribution among people who are earning something. Potentially. So explain the intuition. You're right. So what's the intuition for why it might bias the findings?
Because if a lot of people in our sample and they're not earning that much money, it should think that it doesn't have an effect on trading.
Yeah, so if for whatever reason the treatment led tons of people to start earning money who weren't before, in some ways the composition of people in this graph for the treatment and control groups is no longer comparable, right? Because the selection into earning changed. So that's a fundamental issue. For that reason, we present results in different ways. We try to present as many results as we can for the full sample, because for the full sample we don't have to worry about this issue of kind of some people earning money and others not. So like the hours work result, some people earn 0, they're in the analysis. Some people work 0 hours. Some people work a lot of hours. They're all in the analysis. So there's something attractive about some of the hours work findings because they're full sample findings. Once we get to the earnings findings, people may have selected it. Now what I will say is, if we look at, and this was surprising to us, the proportion of people having any wage earnings is almost exactly the same. We can't reject equality in treatment and control. So you maybe would have thought you're healthier, you're like in the labor force more. Not in our data. The proportion earning wages is the same, but the types of jobs they're doing are really different, and the earnings are very different. So it was surprising to us. Was your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering if you say you include our sample and you include those folks who are working medically or like
Yep. Yep.
Do you include their work hours?
Yes. Yeah, no, so one thing that we really tried to do is make sure we asked about subsistence agriculture work hours as precisely as we could. If you have an agricultural business, we asked separately about those hours and those activities. A non-agricultural business, we asked separately about those activities. Wage earning, current job, all past jobs, etc. So it wasn't like we said, how many hours did you work in the last week and left it there? We asked about all these different activities, but think carefully about the last week in this particular activity, and then we kind of added up. So we feel more confident about the hours work results because if all your hours are in subsistence agriculture, that's fine. That's part of the hours worked here. So we did get some earlier recall as well. The feeling is the recall of hours and time use really deteriorates as you go back farther, whereas earnings not so much. People can tell you what they earned in a month. You know, they may get a pay slip, they may keep track of their profits in their business in terms of a month. When you think about work week, people think of hours per week. So there's sort of conventions about how people think about earnings and work over different time frames. So we try to ask respecting those time frames, basically. Now, when people had previous jobs, earlier jobs, we asked about how much they would typically work in those jobs, say a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and there it's not just last week. It's more of a kind of broad sense of work hours. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, just by looking at the kernel list, you couldn't really tell where the biggest change actually happened, right? Because it could be that I'm looking on the blue curve, which is the very lower end, because there's an inflow possibility. Although, like, you can argue that usually they don't make, like, big jump, but, you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. You know, a kernel density, this is interesting, because, especially for the 274 students, you guys were playing around with all the kernel densities. Kernel densities like this don't tell us all we want to know. To really understand who's gaining and who's not gaining, we need panel data. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get to HIV, maybe by the end of lecture today, but if not, then definitely next lecture, which is we need to know where you were at baseline and where you moved with treatment, say. And once we know that, then we can plot out, okay, what was the treatment effect for people who started out with low earnings? What was the treatment effect for people who started out with medium or high earnings? And we wouldn't plot out the kernel densities in the same way. We can talk about the best way to do that in a couple weeks when we're kind of deeper into panel data. But you're right that in some ways my question was a little misleading before. Oh, where was the effect? You can see where the distributions are shifting, but you can't necessarily say who was doing the shifting with a cross-section alone. You had your hand up?
I was wondering if in the treatment group, was there any variation in amount based on randomly or the treatment?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So we looked at that, and this is another area where we thought we would find effects. It's, it's an interesting thing, with research because you may have 4 or 5 leading hypotheses, and you have to kind of figure out what the right story is, et cetera. We do present in the appendix of this paper those tests. Were the kids? This is what we ask. Were the kids who were younger when they were phased into deworming, like the kids who were in grades 2 or 3, do they gain more than the kids that were in grades 5 or 6? And we typically cannot reject equality of impacts. We might have thought the younger kids would have gained more. We can't reject equality of impact. So that's the finding. Now, the kids who were younger to start with were also younger 10 years later. Not as many of them were in the labor force. So when we do we're currently in the field with a 15-year follow-up, and these guys are in their late 20s. So maybe we'll have better data to tackle that now. Okay, so when we look at, we talked about costs quickly. Now I talked about benefits, really just these labor market benefits. And their earnings gains and hours work gains and occupation shifts and whatnot. It turns out that the cost-benefit calculations, you would guess, looks pretty good. So if you're earning 20% more per year, and these drugs only cost less than $1 per year of treatment, it's not too hard to imagine that the cost-benefit calculation is going to look pretty good. We tried to look at this in a fairly conservative way. We make the assumption, some of these rate of return calculations, that you receive deworming, and then for 10 years, you gain no labor market benefits until we observe you at the 10-year mark, where we do the follow-up survey. Now that's really conservative in the sense that some of these guys were working along the way, and maybe they were more productive because they received deworming. So we assume there's an upfront cost of subsidizing deworming. Then for 10 years, you do nothing. And then from 10 years till retirement age, till you're in your 60s, you earn the kinds of earnings that we find in our survey. And we ask the question, what is the rate of return on that investment? Think of deworming as a human capital investment. You invest when the kids are 10, and then from 20 to 60, you earn. The annualized rate of return, assuming no gains in those first 10 years, and also excluding the externality benefits. I haven't even talked about those. We do find externality benefits 10 years later. The reason we exclude them is some of them are statistically significant, some of them aren't statistically significant. So to be conservative, we can say, let's just forget the externalities, which we already found earlier are probably important. You get an annualized rate of return of 46% in deworming. So that's pretty good. I would like to invest my money in 46% annual return. Over a few years, you do pretty well. So that's a pretty good return. Do you have a question? It's an open question. There are advocates, public health advocates, who have made the very strong claim that child health investments have these massive legacies, that they shape your development, your nutrition, your growth, your cognition, all these things. And so they would say, these are low. Child health has huge impacts. I think there's room for skepticism about that, and that's part of the reason for this study was to try to get hard numbers. But if you compare, let's say, group 1 to group 3, the most extreme case, admittedly, from 7 to 10 years of age, some of these guys were healthier than others. And then the question is, what are the legacies of that? Now, I will say one thing about the self-reported health. So that was one of our measures. With the miscarriage, I talked about self-reported health. The self-reported health measure, and part of the miscarriage measure as well, is a bit hard to interpret because even if there were no permanent health gains due to child deworming, we don't know, let's say, if there aren't. Let's say there were not. But for some reason, because of the education or something else, you earned more because of child deworming. If you earn more as an adult, you earn 20% more, you may have better health as an adult because you can buy more health care, you can go to the doctor more, you're richer. So it's a little complicated to interpret some of these adult health gains because they're the combination of the legacy of child benefits and any benefits from higher income in adulthood. So we acknowledge that. The causality when you go 10 years out becomes a little harder to pin down. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, the attempt here is just an attempt to measure whether that's true. So it's 2 to 3. So on average, say 2.5 additional years of deworming produces these effects, which we think are really large. I mean, they're larger than we expected, and they're quite striking. Did you have your hand up as well? Yeah.
It seems like people are shifting from a informal economy to a
some people, yep.
with that, larger impact on
Yes, that's one of the things we're really interested in.